Today we're continuing our study series on who is Jesus, an important question for us to ask at all times, but especially important during the Advent season when we're thinking about the coming of Jesus as a baby. What does that mean for us? What difference does it make to our lives? We've been looking at the book of Hebrews, a little bit unusual during the Christmas season. We call this a letter, but it's actually not a letter. It's a sermon, really, that was written. And somebody said, I think people must have said, hey, that's a great sermon. We should publish that. And they made copies of it and sent them all over and adapted it a little bit as a letter to make it look a little bit that way since they were sending it to various places. That's never happened to me. Nobody's ever said, hey, let's do that, just so you know. But anyhow, they sent this out, and it was written as a sermon to a bunch of second-generation Christians. That is, people who had been Christians for a while, and honestly, they were a little bit discouraged. They were discouraged because of persecution without, and also some of the things and hopes that they had not been fulfilled. So if this letter speaks to, if we're feeling that way at all, discouraged about our faith, maybe this is a letter that can speak to us. It's written to let us know what we have in Jesus, and to make us aware of what we have, because it's easy to forget the good things that we have in us, right, and around us all the time, because they're there all the time. We forget about them being there. So this was written to help them appreciate what they had in Jesus, and part of the way it does that is to compare what happened in the Old Testament with what happened in Jesus, right, because they knew that what happened in the Old Testament was good. Not only good, but good enough to keep a community of faith together despite all kinds of hardships for generations and centuries. And they had this wonderful connection with God, and now something better had come. Better had come in Jesus. And I tell folks, if you want to remember what the book of Hebrews is all about, think of it as the book of better things. What happened in the Old Testament was good. What happened in the New Testament and in Jesus was better. It's the book of better things. So if we're ever discouraged, this is a book we can turn to because it reminds us to appreciate what we have in Jesus. So far, we've learned that Jesus is better than angels. We read the Christmas stories and we hear about how angels came to visit Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, and we go, hey, where's my angel? The word angel is an interesting one, right? It means messenger. We can have human messengers. We can have divine messengers. We might wonder, but we have something better that came in Jesus, something that is much more valuable. So the first thing, Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than Moses, we learned last week. And Moses, of course, is the great hero of the Old Testament. 4 books of the Bible are written about his life and his ministry and the work that he did. He's the one who mediated the covenant, the 10 Commandments to the Hebrew people, and made them have this special relationship with God. But Jesus, a second and greater Moses, better than Moses. Today we'll learn that he's better than the clergy people we have, right? Which is duh. But anyhow, we'll talk about that. We'll learn how he is the perfect high priest, right? And we'll talk about what that means. This is really the key point. If you're going to analyze what it says in the book of Hebrews, this is the number one point it makes, that he is our perfect high priest. So what's a priest? A priest is first and foremost an intermediary between humans and God, right? It's an intermediary. And in fact, the Latin word for this is pontifex, right? Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. What it really means there is bridge builder, right? So we need a bridge to connect us up with God. Why do we need that? Well, because of the great gulf that exists between God and us, because of who God is and who we are. So God is, of course, the infinite maker of the universe. He is beyond time and space, while we are very finite, living within time and space in a very small place in a very small time, right? We looked earlier at Psalm 8, which has these beautiful words. When I consider the heavens, the busy work of your fingers, the moon and stars which thou hast made, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou dost care for him, right? Who are we? We go out and look at the night sky and we go, wow, it's gigantic. Who are we? God is up there and we're down here. And then, of course, there's sin. We are a fallen people living in a fallen world, and when we look inside our hearts and lives, we know it's not just externally that things are fallen, but we know they're fallen inside. There's hatred and bitterness and anger and other things inside of us that we're not proud of, that we wish weren't there. How can we go to approach a holy God? When Moses heard the call of God. God said, take off your shoes for you're standing on holy ground. Well, that's a reminder, but taking off your shoes doesn't get rid of the dirt, right? My feet are still dirty. We come here and confess our sins and we receive the cleansing power of Jesus in our lives, but we know we're still sinners in need of God's grace and all the grace that he can give us. The gulf between us seems so big. God is too great and we're too small. There's a famous picture that shows this, What is the Sistine Chapel? What does it show? God and man trying to touch, but they can't quite make it. Except that one thing we believe as Christians is that we do make that connection because of what God did for us on Christmas through Jesus Christ. That he bridged the gap, became our perfect high priest to help us connect up in the best and most powerful way. Now, in the Old Testament, priests came from certain families. They had to be Levites, part of that tribe. And, of course, they were expected to live in a certain way. They're supposed to be good moral examples, living righteous lives, not falling into sin and bad things. And even so, when they came to offer sacrifices, what did they have to do before they could offer the sacrifices? They had to offer sacrifices for themselves so that they could be purified and be acceptable and go forward. You see, they're human beings offering these sacrifices. And, of course, their work needed to be repeated over and over and over again, some daily, some weekly, some monthly, some yearly, but over and over again because their work was never complete, never perfect. How could they span the gulf? How could they build the bridge? Chapter 7 of the book of Hebrews, which we're not looking at today, I'm summarizing it for you, says basically, what do we want in a priest? What would be the qualifications for the perfect high priest? It's sort of a job description for them, right? Before we look at that, though, I have this question for you. Suppose you were the President of the United States and you needed the perfect ambassador to connect us up with China, right? Because of all the problems we have with China, you just needed the perfect person, and so you devoted yourself. What would that person look like? What would be some of the qualifications the perfect ambassador to China would have to have? Anybody? They'd have to speak Chinese, and they'd also have to speak English, wouldn't they? Because that isn't going to do us any good if they just speak Chinese, right? We want them to speak both languages fluently and perfectly. What else? What? They'd have to be diplomatic. They'd have to be tactful, right? And know how to say the right things in the right way. Okay? We want somebody who was honest, wouldn't we? At least for our side. We want them to be morally strong enough so that they couldn't be compromised in negative ways, right? What else would we want for them? Patience, yes. We want them to be know the culture of both worlds equally, right? They have to really know Chinese culture as well as ours. And they have to really have a heart and care about both places if this is really going to work, because the people there have to believe they care about them too. You get where I'm going with this, right? When we need a perfect high priest and we start describing him, it sounds a lot like that perfect ambassador. We need just the right person. So chapter 7 is all about what we want in a high priest, somebody who is both God and man so they can connect us up, somebody who understands what it means to be human but also knows what it is to be God, somebody who is morally pure, blameless, somebody who can speak our language, right, and connect up to us. After describing all that, this is what it says in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest. Okay? You see his point? We just described the perfect high priest in chapter 7. We've got him. All right? And it's important for you to know that. A high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heaven. So Jesus wasn't just a man. He's fully God and fully man, and that means he can connect us up. When he died and rose, he went to sit at God's right hand so he can intercede for us. He can be that person who is helping us to find our way into the right relationship with God. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. He's going to talk a lot about the sacrifices that are brought into God's presence on our behalf. We're going to talk about sacrifices next week, so I won't get into that this week. Next week, if you want to hear about that. Then he goes on, verse 3. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. He's going to offer himself, the perfect sacrifice. We'll hear about that next week. Verse 4, if he were here on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. Now what What he's saying there is, Jesus was not of the tribe of Levi. He's from the tribe of Judah. So he couldn't be a priest here on this earth. He doesn't meet the qualifications. I was joking about that last week. I said, we're looking for a successor, and some people said, well, would Jesus get hired? And I go, well, no, because he didn't go to seminary, and he only had 3 years of leadership experience, right? And we're looking for 10. I mean, it is true that we would exclude him because of the qualifications we have. Likewise, Jesus on this earth would not have been a high priest because he was from the wrong family, okay? That doesn't mean he isn't the high priest, right? Because he's after what does the book of Hebrews describe him as? A priest after the order of Melchizedek. And you're all going, oh, what the heck does that mean? What it means is this. There was a priest in the Old Testament who just appeared. And everybody goes, who is he? Abraham came and gave him gifts and tithes and asked him to do sacrifices. Well, who's greater than Abraham? Well, they said Melchizedek. And he was just appointed by God and had this authority directly from God. Where does Jesus get his authority? Directly from God, not from human beings. So it's important for us to hear that and to know that and what it means. So it goes on. It says, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. So at our best, our worship here today is just, we talk about the angels worshiping. We're like this pale reflection of the angels worshiping, right? Some people think that we're joining with them when we worship. I don't know. That seems like a very high view of our worship. But certainly we recognize that what we do here is not as glorious as what it's going to be in the heavens. And he says that's what they do here on this earth. That is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. I don't know if you knew this, but the temple and the tabernacle are all built according to the same pattern. And everything about that pattern was designed to teach you one thing, the holiness of God. There was a space that you weren't supposed to enter, and then you'd enter if you were a Jewish person, and you could go so far, and then they'd offer sacrifices and cleansings, and then the priests would go a little further. And finally, there was one place where only the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest would enter once a year. And according to many traditions, they tied a rope around him, because if something happened to him in there, they weren't going in after him. They were just going to pull him out. Right? So interesting to think of that, how holy it was, how we'd enter into God's presence with care and concern. We don't enter a sanctuary like that today, do we? We enter it with joy and some confidence because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, but all designed to show them the holiness of God. Verse 6, but in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is the mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Now, that's a long sentence, but what he's saying is this. The Old Testament had a covenant, and there were benefits that came with that covenant. We got to have the presence of God in our lives. He would be our God, we would be his people. And we had rules to live by, and there were good things that came from that. But as good as that was, we have something much better in the covenant we have with Jesus, the new covenant. In fact, we name our Bible after this. We have the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the New Testament, the New Covenant. We believe in this new covenant is what we live in. When Jesus died, what did he say at Holy Communion? He says, this is my blood of the new covenant shed for you and for many. This new covenant that was established. And now he's going to talk about this new covenant, this new relationship. And he's going to do it by quoting Jeremiah. And he says this first, verse 7, for if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. So if it had been perfect, we wouldn't have needed another one. But God found fault with the people and said, the days are coming. And now it's all quoting from Jeremiah, the prophet, who had talked about their need to have a new covenant. This is what he's going to say about it. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. And by the way, covenant, that's an interesting word. What it means is, it's from an Assyrian word that means to bind or to fetter. The idea is that in a time of strength, you bind yourself so that in a time of weakness, you don't fall away. So think of important covenants you make, like marriage. When you get married, you're binding yourself in a time of strength, so in a time of weakness, you don't fall away. I mean, it's all cherries and roses and unicorns on that day, and rainbows, and later on, when you're having troubles, you go, and what do you promise on that day? Everybody thinks it's I do. It's not what you promise, it's I will. It's a promise for the future. You bind yourself in a time of strength, so in a time of weakness, you don't fall away. So here it goes. I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. So with the people of God, It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. It's going to be different, a different style. When I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, I led them out of slavery, but this one's going to be different because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them. So there were problems there. We weren't relating the way that we should, declares the Lord. Verse 10, this is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. So the old covenant came on tablets of stone, right? It's external. He says the new covenant's going to be written on their minds and their hearts. And that's what we want, right? A religion, a faith that affects our head and our heart, right? We want that kind of connection with God. I will be their God, and they will be my people. The same promise of the Old Testament, but now made truer because it's internal. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord. That knowing is an interesting word because it doesn't mean knowledge about, it means knowledge of. And I don't have to tell you about God so much because you experience God, right? You know who they are. It's a very different thing when I talk with my brothers and my sisters, when we talk about our parents, we're not telling them so much information about, although once in a while we're surprised, we still learn things, but we know who they were. You see what I'm saying? We don't have to know about nearly so much because we know who they really were. Know the Lord because they will all know me from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. So they'll know and experience the grace of God lived out in their lives. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. So they're making a play on the word covenant or testament. We use that, my last will and testament, right? A will. When you get a new one, the old one no longer counts, all right? And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. So he talks about this new covenant given to us by our great high priest. I'm going to lift up some things for us to learn from this. First of all, we need to appreciate what we have in Jesus. Hebrews 8:1 said, now the main point of what we are saying is this, we do have such a high priest, fully God, fully man, who knows and understands us at our core because he is one of us, our brother, but able to bring us into the very presence of God because he is God, perfect, blameless, sinless, eternal. We don't need to replace him. We don't need to do it over again, who offers the perfect sacrifice and only needed to be done once. But they needed to be reminded of that. I think we need to be reminded of how good and learn how to appreciate everything that we really have available to us in Jesus. Because there's something about us human beings that is never satisfied with things. I tried to find one of my favorite cartoons on this. I found one that's just similar to an idea. Can we have that one of the horses? You ever been there? We're never satisfied with what we have. We look at other things and it seems like they're so good and they're wonderful. We look at other people and their lives and we go, wow, why isn't my life like theirs? And they're probably looking at your life and going, why isn't my life like theirs? And when you get to know people, you realize we all have different problems and struggles, but there's so many blessings and good things that are going on in our lives, and we often fail to appreciate them. This came really home to me. A number of years ago, Joey and I were camping. We go to the same place by Alturas Lake all the time because nobody else goes there. That's the reason we camp there. And it was one morning I got up early because I don't sleep always very well, and I was out there, and I was going to read my book. And as I was looking, though, wow, it's this spectacular sunrise over the lake with the mountains in the background. There was an otter that came out swimming from this little creek not too far away from me. There was an eagle flying overhead that was catching fish. There were ducks in the pond and fish jumping, and it was glorious. And I'm going, wow. And I looked at it for about 10 minutes, and then I noticed I was back to reading my book. And I thought, what does that say about me? I mean, this is spectacular. I came all this way to see it. It couldn't be prettier, and yet I'm back to reading some stupid book. Why? Because we're never satisfied. We're always looking for something new, something different, something better, right? And we don't appreciate always what we have. It's never good enough. The grass is always greener. But we have the perfect thing in Jesus. I was trying to think of an analogy for this. We don't always understand or know what we have until somehow we realize it. I hate to use a COVID analogy because everybody goes, ugh, COVID, and I don't want to think about it anymore. But, when we had that, they were trying to say that you couldn't, we were United Methodists at that time, and they said you couldn't worship in the sanctuary because, the airflow would be bad. I thought, well, what's our airflow here? So we actually had somebody in the church who had connections with the engineers who were studying airflow, right? And we got them to come down here and do a study, and we discovered, I knew we had this, but I never really understood what it was for. We have this giant fan in this space, right? You probably don't notice this, but there's a huge piece of ductwork up in our mezzanine. You probably don't even know we have a mezzanine. There's a secret chamber back there where we store things, and it's got this giant fan in it. And it pulls the air out, and when you turn that puppy on, we'd never turned it on, it circulates the air in here. All the air goes out every 8 minutes. That's amazing. And in fact, so we know the air goes like this in this room if we turn on that giant fan. So, we had this perfect circulation system for infectious disease. And in fact, I asked the engineer, I said, do other places have this? He says, no, I think for a building of your size, you have the best air circulation of any place in Idaho. We didn't know we had it, right? And in fact, I have been complaining that we needed fans so we could cool off the building. We've got the fan that can cool off the entire building. We just pop that thing on and it sucks air out of the entire building, So, hey, we had it, we just didn't know we had it. How often there are things like that in our lives, where we just don't know or appreciate what we really have or don't use it correctly? Years ago, we actually, when I first came here, they didn't have the Eagle Road was different than it was in front of here, and they had railroad ties that were blocking it off that were supposed to separate it from the road. And there came a time when they were going to expand the road and change it, and so we had to pull those railroad ties out. And so we had a guy there who was a former tight end for Iowa State, and he and I were out there pulling some out. We were out there heaving away, and wow, we worked 2 hours and we got 6 of them up. We were just exhausted. And then, I don't think they'd mind me saying this, because the next day, Thad and Mason and Marcus Smith were going to come and do it, and we were going, we're easily 100 pounds more than those guys, and we could barely do it. There's no way they're going to do it. And they came out and looked at it for 2 minutes, got a series of levers and popped those things out, and they did like 10 times as many as we did in half the time. And I was going, because we're idiots, right? Thad, remember that, right? You remember? I was so embarrassed because, I know what a lever is. I've used them before, but somehow, so appreciating what we have is really important, and utilizing what we have. And what we have in Jesus is wonderful. This passage also tells us about clergy and about priestly roles. We're Protestants, and we believe in the priesthood of all believers. What does that mean? It means that every one of us, if we have the Holy Spirit in us, can act as a mediator between God and the world. And we all have a duty to do that, to lead other people to Christ and to pray for them and to act as that connection, building that bridge for people, inviting folks into a deeper relationship with God. But I also know that there are certain times that there are priestly roles, right? So I'm a pastor. I sometimes get called on to do pastoral things just because I'm a pastor, no other reason at all. A friend of mine had this happen. They were brand new to a job. They'd just gotten out of seminary, and they showed up at church in Eastern Oregon, and they had a call, like the third day they were there, to go to visit somebody in a hospital. They'd been in a car accident, and they were told it was a minor accident, and they'd asked for a Methodist clergy. So this person came. The people didn't ask for Methodist clergy. For some reason, somebody decided they needed a Methodist clergy. I don't know. And they got there, and the person was not just ill, they were dying. And in fact, they died when they were there. And he goes, well, they weren't looking for me. They didn't know him from Adam, right? It was just somebody acting in that kind of role. That happens to me sometimes. I go to places and they don't really care about me as a person. It's me playing this role or doing that. When we do the sacrament of communion, right? It's really not about me as a person. It's me leading that ceremony. And, that's an interesting thing, because when I'm doing those types of things, what do I first recognize? Well, imagine if I asked you to help serve communion. What's your first thought? Who am I to do that, right? And you're not worthy even to receive communion, much less distribute it, much less to pray over somebody when they're dying or to be with someone. When we take on those roles, we recognize how weak we are and how we really can't fulfill that role because of who we are and of sin in our lives. To suggest that we could be that kind of bridge builders seems presumptuous almost, right? Yet we're called on to do that to some degree. And we can only do that because of the presence of the Holy Spirit, Jesus in me and in you. And our best work, even then, will be imperfect. I shared, a few weeks ago about the definition of government work, and I said that seems to characterize my life. That's when it's specced in millimeters, measured in inches, and cut with an axe, right? That feels like a lot of my work in the world, trying to present Christ to others. I mentioned earlier, we're trying to find a successor for me now, and we have all these things that we're looking for that are requirements. We didn't say that a seminary degree was actually absolutely required. We said, but it's highly desired and recommended. We said we wanted at least 10 years of experience in leadership, an ability to speak and to share. We want a good resume, and it would be helpful, as we found in almost everybody, that they're appointed and certified and ordained by some kind of denominational authority. In other words, somebody's looked at them and thinks they're good enough to get ordained, right? And I remember thinking through all those and going, because, the priests all had these qualifications. And yet Jesus didn't fit any of those, right? He's better. I've been to seminary. One of my friends defined it as 3 years away from God, It doesn't always bring you closer to God. People that have served in the church for 10 years and they're just tired and discouraged rather than on fire, right? People who can speak, but what they say isn't worth hearing. A resume can be padded and not necessarily helpful. And ordained by a denominational authority, denominations make lots of mistakes, right? In fact, this was all making me think of years ago, we needed somebody, we were trying to hire, this was like 20 years ago, trying to hire somebody to run our preschool. And we had, sometimes we put out a job description, nobody applies, and other times we had tons. This one we had tons. And we had one person who applied that was, wow. All of us who were interviewing were just going, this seems like the perfect candidate. She had multiple degrees. She had all kinds of years of experience. She had glowing references. And I say glowing, that would be an understatement. She'd run her own. She'd worked for others. She had a background in Christianity that was really solid and strong. And we bring her in to interview, and wow, she was blowing us away. She's incredibly young for this. She was just like 35 years old, right? Despite all having all these qualifications. And, we're about ready to hire her. I can just tell that's the feeling in the room. And I asked this question. I said, well, there's a gap here. For the last 2 years, you haven't been doing this, and you sold the preschool that you've been running. And she says, yes, my grandmother got ill in Missouri, and I had to go there and be with her. I'm making up Missouri, so you won't get this. Anyhow, so she said, I had to go there and take care of her. And I said, now I really want to hire her, because now I'm sympathetic with her now, right? And I could tell that's the same way everybody was feeling. And then she's getting up to go, and she says, but I should tell you this. And then she began to tell us how when she was there in Missouri, taking care of her grandma, she was lonely and alone. So she started corresponding with this guy in prison, and then she got involved with him romantically and sexually. And then she starts going on, and oh my gosh, several felonies were involved and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it went on for like 20 minutes, and all of us are going, and it was just shocking how her life had spiraled into this thing. And clearly she needed to have like 3 or 4 years of just time off to recover from all this, as well as maybe some heavy therapy. And then she says, she finally concludes, she says, well, I know I'm not going to get the job, but it felt so good to get that off my chest. And my only thought is, we came this close to hiring her, this close. If she hadn't said anything, we would have. So you never know, the external things aren't what's important nearly so much as where the heart is. And that's so hard for us to judge because of who we are, right? Jesus didn't have the external, but he had the internal things that were absolutely right. And I thank God that we're not dependent on a human high priest or a human pastor with all our flaws. We're dependent on the high priest we have in Jesus. The key thing, though, of this passage that you need to hear, and it's the meaning of Christmas. We watch all these TV specials, and they're all talking about what's the true meaning of Christmas, and they come up with the stupidest definitions, don't they? It's about friends, it's about family, it's about light, it's about laughter, it's blah, 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 blah. About the perfect, romance or hot cocoa, or you ever notice those Hallmark specials? They're all drinking hot cocoa. When was the last time you as an adult that drank hot chocolate? I don't think I've had it in 20 years. Anyhow, they're always doing that, and they're always, it's all this snow and blah, blah, blah. It's not. What is it about? It's about one thing, the incarnation. God became a human being. That blows our brains. It's hard to get our minds around. It's easier to get around hot chocolate, right? But that's what it's really all about. It is about the fact that Jesus is fully God and fully man, and that means we know that God understands us, cares for us, loves us. In fact, the whole message of this is that God deigned to come down to us because we needed a helping hand. We have a stained glass window. I think we have it here ready to show in a picture too, of the hand coming down. I don't know if you know, the hand is the oldest symbol for the Father. And it was this hand coming down. And it sounds horrible, but it's beautiful actually when you see it, right? This disembodied hand coming down. God's hand reaching down to us to pull us up, to pull us out, to give us help, because we need that hand. And of course, we see that in Jesus, and this is, of course, is a different symbol we have, is the symbol of the cross. We've got another window that talks about sin and grace and how we need God's help. And what's in the center of that? The cross. Right? I guess the top's missing there on this one, but the cross is there. And what does that beam show us, the one going up and down? It connects us, we say, from the heavens to the earth, right? And then we talk about how it connects us up with the cross beam with one another. God doesn't abandon us, but comes to give us grace, forgiveness, wholeness, a helping hand. All that brings us into a new relationship, a new covenant. One not external, but one internal. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't external signs of it. Doesn't mean there aren't external things that we need to do. But it does mean that the real significance of the covenant and relationship we have with God is known only in our hearts and in our heads, right? Someone once told me that's the only Bible we carry with us, the one that's here and here, right? And that's true. Our relationship with God is dependent upon that inner connection, not on these outward signs. So it's not about coming to church or tithing or how much service we do, although I think those are all external signs that do mean something, but it's really about the connection we have with God and God's connection with us. That grace, that forgiveness, that love that was demonstrated to us and our response to it, right? The new relationship and covenant we have, head and hearts. And God carves his love into our hearts, right? Let's have a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, we just thank you for the way that you came to be our high priest. You didn't stay in the heavens, but became one of us and gave so much for us. You came in divine humility, not forcing yourself on us, but offering yourself to us in love so that we could accept or reject. And we pray, Lord, that we might accept you into our hearts and lives this Christmas season and always. In Jesus' name, amen.